Alors, cette question-là peut-être ouvre la porte à notre prochain conférencier qui va nous présenter en fait un peu le modèle, un des modèles les plus fructueux de la recherche internationale en horticulture. Puis je parle ici du Dr. Ian Ferguson, qui vient de Nouvelle-Zélande et qui était le Chief Science Advisor pour un organisme de recherche qui s'appelle là-bas le Plant and Food Research en Nouvelle-Zélande. Il est maintenant le consultant en chef, le Chief Science Advisor pour le ministère de l'Agriculture, le ministère des Industries primaires en Nouvelle-Zélande. Alors, le Dr. Ferguson est un scientifique de haut niveau. C'est un des chercheurs qui a travaillé beaucoup en physiologie végétale au niveau de la post-récolte. Vous allez comprendre, pour la Nouvelle-Zélande, qui est un pays qui exporte, qui est à 1000 km de toute terre habitée, exporte de manière importante. Alors, la post-récolte, pour eux, c'est essentiel. Et le docteur Ferguson, donc, a contribué pour que son pays puisse exporter aussi bien les pommes que les kiwis à travers tout le monde. Alors, il a occupé beaucoup de postes de direction à travers toute la Nouvelle-Zélande. Il a reçu l'ordre du mérite de la Nouvelle-Zélande en tant que chercheur exceptionnel. Il est également, pour vous dire son influence ici au Canada, il est membre du comité aviseur international du centre de recherche de Vineland. Alors, il connaît probablement mieux Vineland et l'Ontario que nous tous. Alors, c'est une personne très influente avec une grande connaissance de l'horticulture internationale. Alors, il va nous entretenir du modèle du financement de la recherche en Nouvelle-Zélande et d'un des organismes de recherche qui est en fait l'équivalent d'Agriculture Canada en Nouvelle-Zélande, qui a été privatisé au cours des dernières années pour créer donc une unité qui s'appelle Plant and Food Research. Et donc, M. Ferguson, you're up deck. Je dois dire que je remercie énormément Dr. Ferguson d'être parmi nous, parce que vous comprendrez que c'est l'été présentement en Nouvelle-Zélande. Il faisait 30 degrés là-bas. Il a fait un voyage de plusieurs jours pour venir nous entretenir au cours de ses vacances estivales. Alors réellement, il nous fait une faveur d'être ici et de présenter la vision du ministère de l'Agriculture. Thank you very much.
Bonjour, I'm awake, and I do apologize for speaking in English. I learned French when I was at school, and I'm afraid that was all it was. It's a great pleasure to be here. I do come to Canada, as Yves has said, several years now. I've been on the advisory committee for Vinelands, but I've moved off that now. But it means that we have always had a very good link with Canada. And you might think that's surprising, New Zealand and Canada a long way away, big country, small country. But we have a lot of similarities. We are, of course, in the Commonwealth. We are old colonies. We have a colonial background and a way of doing things and a way of breaking in country and developing agriculture and horticulture, often from the natural land. We also both have neighbours, large neighbours, who we love and we hate. We have Australia, you have the US, and we both learn, I believe, to exploit them very successfully. So what I want to do to talk to you today is three things really about horticulture in New Zealand. I want to talk a little bit about the horticulture industry, and then talk about the science system very briefly to give you some understanding of how the science system in New Zealand funds science, and then about research, the major research organisation And as Eve has said, I was Chief Scientist of Plant and Food Research for about 10 years, and the last 2 or 3 years have moved, still have a part-time employment with Plant and Food, but now I'm the Chief Science Advisor for the Ministry of Primary Industries. So I used to be an expert on horticulture, and now I'm an expert on everything, from forestry to climate change to fisheries. Of course, an expert in everything, as they say, but a master of none. There are some major features about New Zealand horticulture. You probably have this feeling that it is quite a successful industry. And the success of it does come down to a few very important features. First of all, we're a very small country, 4 million people. Not much, but larger than, in fact, the population of Montreal. And so we're very small. We do not concern ourselves with the domestic market. New Zealanders can eat whatever they can eat. We want to send everything overseas. And because our horticulture industry and agriculture is so export orientated, it becomes a national government priority, an economic priority, and that has a huge impact on funding and the science system and the whole system of setting up of agriculture and horticulture. It is because it is export orientated, the government suddenly becomes very, very interested. We also do not work in commodities, apart from milk powder going into China, which will probably go up and decline. We are the company of Fonterra is the world's largest international dealer in milk products. We do not generally involve ourselves in commodities because we're not big enough. Labour is too expensive. We're not a big producer. We do involve ourselves in premium markets with high-value products. And that is what we target. Even our fresh fruit, our fresh products are not for commodities. They go to the top of the market. Our wine goes to the top of the market for high-value products. We cannot compete at the low end of the market, which means that we are globally competitive. We are not the cheapest, and we don't apologize for that. We also are very well organized. Being small, we have very good grower organizations, and we have levies which are mandated by government. They do have to be put out for the vote amongst growers or amongst the industry, and it is the levies which ensure funding both into marketing and into the research. And it's a very important feature of our industries. We also, of course, I'll say this because I've got an interest in it, but we are enabled by very close relationships with world-leading research organizations. And there's one other point I want to make, which is a bit unusual perhaps when you look at the list of these things, and that is we put enormous value on genetics. And I'll explain what I mean by that. First of all, when I mentioned that we are export orientated, you can see that if you look at the various components of the New Zealand industry, we have the total industry is about 6.7 billion and the exports of 3.6 billion, about 8% of all our exports, employing 50,000 people. But when you look at how it's broken down, you can see that our, say, fruit export component here, and this is the domestic component, our wine exports are almost twice as large as our domestic spend, and we can see even vegetables, the export industry is getting close to the size of the domestic one as well. So this, as I said before, is a very important part of our industry, and is the export industry, and most of the research that gets done in these sectors, in fact, is done in the export components, not the domestic. You can see where the growth has been over the years. These are data for our horticultural exports going from 1975 to 2012, and it's starting to tail off a little bit. You can't keep going like this forever. It does go up and down. You can see where the growth is, though. The growth is in the wine industry and in the fresh fruit industry, and not the processed fruit. And this is something that New Zealand has become very, very good at. Although we're a long way away from our markets, that fruit has to get into a market in a condition which is not like me. The fruit cannot be jet lagged. The fruit has to get there in a very, very fresh and high quality condition. And so New Zealand has become very, very good at being able to export fresh products at this high quality, high value market a long way away from where it is grown. Normally when we think about high value products into the market, they tend to be processed and manufactured products. In our case, it is the fresh product. When we can see where the growth is, it's very obvious that most of the growth now is occurring in Asia. This is horticulture export growth up to 2012. The Pacific Rim countries currently account for more than 70% of our horticultural products, compared to about 60% 10 years ago. And it's a growing market. Asia itself is a growing market of 32%. Australia has increased, and of course recently we have gained access for apples into Australia, which were banned because of black spot disease. We now can get that in, and so we're getting substantial growth into Australia. You'll see that in North America, you folk are not doing your job. We need to get more fresh fruit into North America and into the UK and EU, which is our traditional market. In fact, the markets there are fairly static. Most of the growth is into Asia. This has a huge impact on what we produce and the kind of produce. It doesn't mean we don't grow apples, it means we have to grow different types of apples to cater for those sorts of markets. Our traditional apples going into Europe are just about disappearing, and we have to shift varieties which are compatible with the Asian consumer. What is New Zealand advantage? Thank you. Actually, stuff must be a big right there. What is the New Zealand advantage? One of the things that's very common in New Zealand is the responsiveness of the growers. I often joke that the chainsaw in our apple orchards is the most useful piece of farm equipment. In other words, we can shift into new varieties very, very quickly, mainly because we are small. There has been quite a move recently for horticulture to be aggregated into bigger units, but it is still dominated by relatively small but quite innovative growers. So they're very responsive, and they can move very quickly if they have to. As a good example of this, I'll show later on in kiwi fruit, which has been ravaged by a bacterial disease. We have a good climate, we have good light, we have too much light. In fact, for us, we all get melanoma and get sunburn. And the other important thing is counter-seasonal to the northern hemisphere markets, which means that we do have windows of export opportunity. We can get avocados, for instance, into California only for just a few weeks between other suppliers. So we have to be adaptable, but we can get into northern markets in very, very small slots often, which have a big impact. We have a strategy where the industry has a particular strategy. It tends to grow from overall about 5 billion to about 10 billion by 2020. It's one of these strategies which you sort of say, how do you get 10 billion? So well, we'll just hold our finger to the air and say, we're going to get 10 billion. But in actual fact, these sorts of figures are very, very important in an industry to have something aspirational to grow to think we want to achieve something. Even if you don't do it, it is very important to be and try and get there, to have that aspiration. So the industry is very strategic on that basis, and it is very important when it comes to science and research. And there's some major features also about the industry itself. It is very important and is very aware of keeping ownership of IP. This can be a very contentious issue these days, particularly around varieties, but it is an important part of the New Zealand horticulture scene. And the commercialisation of IP on a global scale, the control of varieties, club varieties, that type of thing, the modern movements in international agriculture. Niche varieties, beyond, we are very, very keen on sustainability. We have this mantra about clean, green New Zealand, the New Zealand brand. I can tell you that we're not as clean and green as we say, but then what country is. But it is part of our marketing, and it is part of our image, and it is part of what we want to do in horticulture and agriculture. Unbelievably, for a country which knows we get a lot of rain, we actually have getting drought, we have water problems, we have water quality problems, all the usual things of advanced agricultural and horticultural systems that are starting to hit New Zealand. We have to cope with those if we want to use the image of sustainability and greenness as part of our marketing. It's been a very important one. I was just talking about hops last night. As we're drinking beer, we export hops. And one of the biggest features of them is the very, very low chemical use of pesticides in the use of the hops, and they are marketed very successfully because of their cleanness. And we also are very attuned to what customers want. I'll come back to that later. I just want to talk a little bit about, I mentioned about genetics, and I have to move on, but I just want to just really emphasize this point about our breeding and about our new varieties and our genetics. And these are of course our Asian pears, which we are breeding with common pears. Again, I want to emphasize the high-value products, the high niche high-value markets, and the consumer itself has been the endpoint for our development. And I just want to give you one example, for instance, about this high-value aspect. Now, green kiwi fruit are rapidly becoming a commodity, which means that the price starts to drop and you have to keep the volume up. It's the race to the bottom in economic terms. What we were able to do within that commodity was to identify in the Japanese market a preference for sweeter fruit, and we could relate that back to high dry matter content, which is really just a measure of the carbohydrate levels in the fruit, by taste, going into Japan and doing taste studies on our varieties. And we were able then to develop a new category within the commodity. And so, although it is a commodity product, there's a new category in it with high dry matter, a sweeter fruit. And the interesting thing about this is that growers who produce fruit over a certain level of high dry matter were getting a premium. And so they were making money for developing that commodity, and that also meant that as scientists had to go back into the orchards to show them how to grow the fruit with the high dry matter, and then the grower could get the return on it. Developing a high-value commodity, high-value product or category out of a commodity was very important. Again, value of genetics. These days everyone is analysing, sequencing genomes. New Zealand has been a very important player in some of these ones, and this is plant and food research itself. And we have been involved in the whole genome sequencing of apple, kiwi fruit, strawberry, potato, and pear in international consortium. And you can see the type of material that we have to play with in terms of kiwi fruit and our apples, of course. The apple genome, we were a major player in, so we have access to that. It's become a very, very important tool for us. Same with the pear genome and with the kiwi fruit genome. These are kiwi fruit. And I do want to emphasize again, kiwi fruit, the importance of the germplasm and the importance of ownership of germplasm. The interesting thing about kiwi fruit is that these are species, whereas if you have the same display of apples, it's the same species, usually a whole lot of different varieties developed over many centuries. Kiwi fruit is one of the most recently domesticated of all fruit, and so we are still able to have species to play with skins perhaps which are peelable, with different colours of carotenoids and anthocyanins to provide novelty and to provide nutritional components, and different sizes and different levels of sugars and acids. So it's very important to have the germplasm if in fact you're going to develop an industry such as this one. And again, I like the pictures, they're good pictures, so I keep putting them up. These are some of the crosses of kiwi fruit between Actinidia chinensis and Melanandra, the sorts of work fruit that we're now working on. I'll just turn very quickly now then to our government science system. New Zealand does have a fairly robust system, but it is not anything like as high in terms of R&D expenditure as many other countries, and many other small countries for that matter. Our expenditure is only about 0.6% of GDP, which is not high. I did look up Canada's, just in case I was going to embarrass you. But I'd be guessing a bit more than that, I would hope so. Our total investment in science is about 1.5 billion, but that depends how you calculate it. And about 20% of our government science is directed towards agriculture as a whole. That's interesting. It's an interesting percentage, this, because 70% of our exports are in the agricultural products, that's agriculture and horticulture. Of course, that includes dairy, the monster in the room, meat and wool, horticulture, but only 20% of government science is directed into it. Now, you might say that that is an indication of how efficient our agricultural industries, our primary sector industries are in being able to export that much. It does mean the government is also, though, very keen on diversifying and trying to get other aspects of the economy and high-value manufacturing, IT, and put R&D into those. So, from where I stand in the research organisation, I believe this is too low, but the government wants to spread its efforts to stimulate new growth. So the government investment is split across a number of mechanisms. It has a large portion of it in collaborative mechanisms where it does insist on whole teams, and New Zealand, not being divided up into provinces, as you are in Canada, can work as a whole. And it does mean that we can assemble teams of researchers across the country very, very easily, across universities and CRIs. And so collaborative research is a very important aspect. We have a very large pool of money available for researchers, which we call contestable. That means entirely competitive. You put a competitive grant in. Most of these competitive grants have to have industry as a cornerstone or as a collaborator in some way with co-funding. There's very, very little money of government that goes out which does not demand industry input. And that can be from industry being engaged in some way within kind right up to the matching dollar for dollar. But the government is very insistent on having industry input. There are also institutional funds, which is money which is given over into the institutions, such as the universities, on a performance-based method. In other words, they don't provide money for the research for universities based on numbers of students. They're based on a performance-based system, which makes the academics very nervous. And we also have, I'll come back to this, what we call core funding for CRIs. I'll come back to talk about that in a moment because it's become very important. And then we have a certain amount of government money into infrastructure and support, and probably not enough, and probably not strategically designed enough. But that's the sort of breakdown we have of government investment into science. You can see also that when they look at where this money has been spent, you may not see the words down from within the room, but this is the manufacturing sector, and you can see there is very, very large business input, which is the light blue. The purple is the government input and higher education input into the funding for science in this area. And this is primary sector here, and it's the second largest component, and is certainly the largest component in this case of government expenditure on R&D. That's here, and a substantial part of industry also putting money in. This is health, and this is environment. And so the government is trying to increase its level of input to here, but this is where most of the R&D is being spent, and I suspect it's very much the same in most countries. And just last one on the New Zealand funding scene, my own ministry, the Ministry of Primary Industries, is funding about $130 million worth of research, particularly in sustainable production, irrigation, climate change, greenhouse gases. We host a greenhouse gas centre, an international one, which Canada is part of in terms of the Global Research Alliance for Greenhouse Gases. We put a lot of money into biosecurity, which is a huge issue in New Zealand, and you know if you're coming to New Zealand, it's easy to bring in a bomb, but you cannot bring in an apple or a banana. And food safety, a very, very important part of New Zealand research input and regulations because of our food exports. And we've had a few problems and issues, for instance, in milk powder in China in recent times. And then a lot around industry partnerships and fisheries resource and aquaculture. So the ministry itself, which funds separately, is a major player in primary production research. It doesn't fund basic research, it funds very applied research in these areas. So what about plant and food research? let's dwell a little bit more on that, then, which is really why I think I'm here. Plant and Food Research is a Crown Research Institute. About 20 years ago, the government took what was then DSIR, which is a term that you'll be familiar with in Canada, for those of you who can remember, also in Australia, CSIRO. These were government research organisations which had stations in various departments and components. They've all changed over the years in all countries. In New Zealand, about 20 years ago, the government took all these and converted them into 7 Crown Research Institutes. These were standalone institutes, and you can see what they covered. Plant and Food Research covered horticulture, field crops and seafood, Ag Research, Dairy, Pasture Science, Meat and Wool, and so on, Land Care Research, Natural Estate, Biodiversity, Forestry, the Marine Environment, Environmental Science, Forensics, and the Earth Sciences. So a very natural set of research organisations. The extension side of the old Ministry of Agriculture disappeared, and that was built into these as well, and often people see that that was a large mistake. In other words, there was a loss because at that time there was a very fundamental shift in the philosophy of government, and that was user pays. In other words, growers, if they wanted extension services and advice from government, had to pay for it. It took a long time for growers to accept that and to move into a new mode. It also created a new industry of consultants. And also it meant that these institutes, as I'll explain, were set up to stand alone, be financially viable, which meant that the industry had to pay for research. And a lot of the industry, and this will be familiar with many of you, think, why should we pay twice? We pay our taxes. Why shouldn't we pay once again for research outcomes? But this is where the change was made about 20 years ago. And the nature of these Crown Research Institutes, they are government-owned. They are owned, the 2 shareholding ministers, the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Science, but they are set up as a private company. And this is a very, very important concept. It's a little bit of a half and half, but in fact it has become a very, very effective mechanism. And so the structure of the CRI is that a board is set up, board of directors by government with a chairman. Very much as a private company has a board, so there are economists on it, there are accountants, there are scientists, but it is a board set up for research skills, or for a skill-based board and business research. The board will appoint the CEO, so the government has no say in who the CEO is, nor do they have any say in how much is paid. The CRI can pay as much as it likes to all its staff. And then the CEO, of course, sets up a management system, usually with general managers and the usual type of management structure. This is quite independent. This is run quite independent. The Ministry of Science and the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment monitors the funding of this through government funding, and it monitors its performance. The Ministry of Finance and the Treasury measures the financial performance and viability. This company, which is called a company, has to be financially viable, it has to stand on its own, it has to provide a dividend back to the government, or at least offer one. It can also make profits, it can invest, it can do everything a private company wants to. And so what are the characteristics? First of all, it is owned by government, but run as a private company. And to be truthful, there's very, very little interference from government. None of them have failed. The government takes a close watch on them, but there's very, very little direct ministerial interference into the organisation. As I said before, as a board of directors appoints a CEO, it has to be financially viable. This is a very, very important thing here. They have profitability, paying a dividend, full costing overheads for all contracts, including government. And this was established from day one and has been absolutely vital. It does raise the cost of all our science, but nevertheless it puts the independence of our science system back into the Crown Research Institutes, because they then have money in hand and they are able to control their own business. And this means, when I say full costing, that means full costing. All our contracts have full overheads, based on staff salaries. That has to cover all the infrastructure. The government pays nothing for our infrastructure, for our buildings, for our libraries, for our computing. That is all paid for by the organisation, by the institute itself. Government has no input into that. And also means, and this is a very interesting one here, which I used to talk about down in Vinelands when they're starting to run a similar system. There's one extra thing, it's the icing on the cake. We can put a profit margin on every contract. So even every government contract, every competitive contract, we can put, if we want to, a 10% margin on that for profit. And we can then use that money back to reinvest back into our infrastructure, to pay salaries, increase salary increases, bring in new staff, to develop new buildings, to set up new businesses. And it's a very important feature. No business can actually run properly without that type of structure. We can invest our own funds in capital assets. In fact, Plant and Food is rebuilding, has put up a lot of new buildings recently, is completely refurbishing its headquarters. We can set up new businesses, spin-offs and partnerships. It's not something we do very much of because one of the problems with a spin-out is that you do still have to have a cash flow into it, and often it is not a good scheme to have cash from coming out of competitive grants from government being feeding into new businesses because you can drain your base of research. And we can establish an international presence. So Plant and Food has people stationed overseas. We have freedom to do that. But underneath it all, of course, is a core purpose of our institute, which is to underpin economic growth and meet environment and society bottom lines. So we still have a very, very strong brief and a very, very strong statement of core purpose. Our own organisation, over 850 employees, are spread right across New Zealand, the headquarters in Auckland, but we probably have too many particular stations, research stations across the country, but they are all in areas of local production. So kiwi fruit is very heavily centred in the Bay of Plenty here, apples in the Hawke's Bay, we have a wine institute here, we have hops, we have seafood all across north part of the South Island. Our stone fruit is based in central Otago, and so on. So many of our sites where we have people located is based on the actual growing region, which allows that intimate interaction with our growers. We also have a very extensive international strategy. We have someone permanently placed, an office in California, in Davis. We have had someone permanently placed in Spain, working closely with ERTA, and we're looking at getting locations in China, and we have several people in Australia where we're managing new business and managing new research opportunities. Our level of international activity is often one of some discussion. There are many organisations around the world, universities, who are going international very big time. We're sort of halfway in between. How we organise? We are organised into 5 different portfolios, and this includes breeding and genomics right across all our crops. Remember, we do vegetable crops and fruit crops and field crops. Our bioprotection section, which is all about diseases and pests and diseases and biosecurity and biodiversity. We have another portfolio of sustainable production, which is moving very quickly away from just canopy management and apples and fruit trees and that type of thing into the whole area of sustainability, land use and water use. Food, we have a large food section which includes post-harvest science, which is my own area, and also functional foods and food development and sensory science, particularly sensory and consumer science. And then we have a seafood section, which is a little bit separated from the rest, but is there for historical reasons. Seafood being one of New Zealand's big growth areas for industry and for science. But the most important aspect of all this is that this is all organised within one organisation, one institute, which means that we can put together the whole package from the germplasm, from the genetics, to the consumer. And this is very, very important in going out to industry, to be able to contract with them, to do research with industry, because we can say, we can come to you with a geneticist with a crop physiologist, with a plant pathologist, and with a consumer scientist, and put them into one program. And then we can come to you and talk with the industry about meeting industry needs and industry growth. This whole package is absolutely vital for us. And you can see it here, if you take apples, we have a very large apple breeding program. We have a lot of work on apple production, bioprotection, post-harvest, and sensory science. It is a virtuous cycle, and the most important thing about this is that each of these components feeds back into our breeding program. The breeders are not isolated. The breeders talk very closely to sensory science because they're then looking for consumer traits they have to be looking at in their breeding. They have to look at disease resistance. They have to look at the post-harvest quality of the fruit. And in the ideal world, all the traits associated with these components of the cycle are feeding back and becoming traits, often through our genomics programs and biomarkers or through traditional breeding into our genetic programs. And this cycle and this feedback loop is a very, very important part of what I believe the success of New Zealand horticulture. We also have the horticulture industry, as I said before, is driven by very, very strategically driven, and plant and food itself has to take the industry targets around seafood and around food and beverages and horticulture and cropping, and from where we are now, about 7 billion, 1.5 billion in these areas. These are larger than what I talked before because they have more components to where they want to be. And plant and food strategy then says, how do we contribute to the growth in these areas? Our revenue, it is about 120 million, which is about 110 million Canadian as of yesterday. Contestable funding, which is competitive funding put out there for competition, about 18 million. Industry contracts, about almost 40 million, about 33% of our revenue comes straight from industry contracts. I want to highlight two things though. First of all, royalties. I talked about how breeding and genetics is very important. Plants and food gets about $16 million worth of revenue per year on royalties. And for the financial people in the company, this is bottom line. For the scientists, hey, it's money we can reinvest. And so there's always this tension across it. But for instance, we have an agreement with the kiwi fruit industry which says, we will give you the plant variety rights, we don't retain them. It's best if the industry holds those plant variety rights, you give us a royalty in return. It means you both have what we call skin in the game. It means that Plant and Food is not the best organisation to be handling plant variety rights. The industry is better, it can control international production that way. But we get a royalty back, and we have also agreed with the kiwi food industry to spend at least half that royalty back into research. So it's that type of operating agreement with industry, royalty-based plant variety rights, which has been a very successful model. So these royalties are very important. They do give us disposable income to do things which is not tagged to anything unless we have a particular agreement around with the industry. We also have what is called funding. 4 or 5 years ago, the government decided that most of our government money was in this contestable area. They decided, after a lot of lobbying, that that was not a stable system. You cannot run research organisations where 60% of your funding is up for rebidding and competitive. It does not provide long-term stability, and they have converted a substantial part of that, in our case 36% of our revenue, to what they call core funding. They said, we'll take all these contracts and we're going to hand them over. We think you're good enough to be able to make your own decisions on that, and we have a decision-making process, and that's what we do at the moment. And so, if you look at the breakdown across the type of research, we have, in terms of investigator-led, we have some, it's very important to maintain this level here. Sector-targeted, this is research targeted to a particular industry sector and then extension, and you can see that these various revenue components are spread across that. And I would point out one other, in that we do ring-fence about $10 million of our revenue out of the core funding for fundamental research. You can lose fundamental research in a research organisation like ours very, very quickly. It can disappear. You have no credibility as a science organisation unless you can do some fundamental research. You have to feed the new ideas. You have to allow your scientists to be able to develop new ideas, blue sky ideas. You have to be able to take a lead beyond industry and not just be reactive. One of the dangers of research organizations in the current world is that they become service organizations. Research organizations have to be able to provide a science lead, and that has to be something which is protected. We have to be very jealous about it. We have to allow scientists to develop new ideas. And the tendency is to tie everything down to be just reactive and not proactive. That's a very important feature. So this core funding comes directly from government, and it must align with our core purpose, and the board makes the final decision on it. But it does raise another issue I just want to talk very briefly about, is about how we make decisions. And this, in a way, comes back to the very core of the success of a research organisation, particularly one which has income or revenue to spend at its own, for its own needs or its own strategy. And so we have developed a whole investment system, and that doesn't just cover core funding, it covers the whole approach to the science that we do. It has to consider all sources of funding, it has to be co-innovation, has to consider everything external and internal forces, and all decisions are made up after weighing a number of factors. And basically it's based on a research portfolio where we sit down with an industry. Let's just say a research portfolio in this case is the kiwi fruit industry. We agree on what the growth targets might be. In other words, we have a model of co-investment for agreed outcomes. We, as a research organisation, are sitting down. We have money ourselves to put money on the table. How much more powerful is that than going to the table with the industry and saying, well, we haven't got any money, we'd just like some of yours so that we can do something together. We can say, we'll put money on the table and you put money on the table. We will co-invest for an agreed outcome. And we can do that by looking at the strategies. We can also bring in some government funding, our own investment, the industry investment. We can go out together and hunt for other money outside and build up a research portfolio on agreed outcomes for economic growth of the sector. And this is the basis of our investment process. It is an integrated one where we're co-investing. And so we take all our sectors, it might be kiwi fruit, potato, avocado, some of the pan-sector ones, biosecurity, and we look at them in terms of our research portfolios. We also have a Maori, I should just mention, Maori component which runs right across the organisation. We have a strong, and all the organisations have a strong commitment to what we call visual mataranga, which is the Maori component of the economy and science. And we take these sectors, these research portfolios and the strategies, we develop a strategy, we look at investment options for our strategies, we look at what the impact might be. We take these to an investment committee, which is made up of our general managers and business people within the organisation, and develop portfolio options. And then we take that back to the board and senior management to ratify and agree. And we have an investment cycle. You may not be able to read the words, but very quickly, we prioritise research areas for investment, we take the investment decisions, we design programs, we implement, we monitor and evaluate and review, we report on that, and then on the outcomes of that, we'll feed that back into reviewing the investment portfolio. It is a circular system of investment, implementation, review, feeding back the results. How do we make decisions? We develop sector strategies and use sector metrics. We look at impact and risk and experience. And we look, for instance, we take a sector, I haven't labelled it here, but you might say something which is probably something like kiwi fruit or apples or pip fruit or avocados. We look at their revenue, we look at their growth rates. If they're not growing, we have to ask why. And maybe that the industry is not in a state even to be able to grow. We have to look at the R&D effort that's going in, and we look at the funding source of that, for instance. And this particular sector has a lot of plant and food money going in, has a bit of government money, has a large area of commercial money. So we look at all these, we analyse all these different parts of the sector. We look at the attractiveness, we look at sector research intensity. We say, how much is the industry itself contributing to R&D? An industry which contributes nothing into R&D could be either because it hasn't got enough money, or simply because it is not particularly, has a mentality about how R&D can allow it to go forward. And so we analyse that, we analyse the R&D market share for plant and food. Does plant and food have a lot of the market of the R&D they're spending in this particular sector? It is spending almost 80% of its research money into plant and food research already. Others here have none. And we look at the industry commitment. In other words, if the industry commitment is one, it means it is matching government money dollar for dollar. In some cases, it is well behind that. We take all these factors into account when we decide where we want to invest. And we look at impacts, we look at value to New Zealand of the industry. Is it growth or strategic value, sector size? Is it a value to plant and food? We have to be a viable organisation. We are a business. Is it value to us? Is it a dollar value? Is the return on investment good? What's the strategic value to us? And how much can our R&D make a difference? Often, a little bit of research might make a huge impact on an industry. Some industries we can put a large amount of money for a marginal impact. We have to be able to assess that. We've got to be efficient about these types of things. And the same about risk. Is the sector ready? Does it have a strategy? Is it co-funding? In other words, we're putting the sector and the industry on the line and say, in some extent it sounds very arrogant, but are you guys ready for us? Just as industry says, is plant and food ready for the industry? We have to do this in two ways. And then we have to look at market regulator readiness, likelihood of science success, and ability to deliver. These are the risk factors. And we can take our industries and we can plot them against these impact and against risk. And ideally, you want to have an industry up here which is low risk in terms of risk of achievement, but has very, very high impact. And so these are these industries up here, our seafood, our kiwi fruit, and apples and those. These are some of the smaller ones down here. And while you want all these industries to be up into this area, because this is where we're going to have the biggest impact in terms of R&D, sometimes some research money into a small industry at a very high risk can suddenly push an industry very high if you can get a game-changing piece of research, a new variety into an industry which has become stagnant, a new growing method it didn't know about. You can make that shift. And so we can invest, we like to invest in many of these sectors because this is where the growth and success will be, and this often will actually reduce our investment in some of these. And so we have done that recently. We've increased our funding in some sectors by $1 million or so because the industry was putting money in as well, wants to co-invest, and is also leveraging new government money. We've reduced our spending in some industries because the industry has no goal, no strategy, doesn't know where it wants to go. We can only help so much. And as a result of that, the industries have often got together and created a growth strategy. I just want to end up with a couple of examples of how we actually work. Some of you might know that our kiwi fruit industry, particularly our very, very high value gold kiwi fruit, was hit by a bacterial disease, Pseudomonas actiniae, in 2010. It has now wiped out that variety. But a very important message I want to get across about the organisation, the research organisation of plant and food research, was discovered, the disease was discovered in 2010. We were able, because we have this ability to do what we want to do, we have our own responsibility, we were able to shift probably over 100 staff out of other areas within the organisation into working on PSA. Maybe for a few months, maybe for weeks, and maybe for a year or two. If all those staff were working in contracted research from government or somewhere else, or in a university, can you imagine a university, and no disrespect to a university, can you imagine a university which is able to put these people together in an emergency like that? So we're able to do that. We were able to invest over $1.5 million into PSA, and in fact, we now have a new variety which is online, which is now into production to get over that problem. And just the last one to show the developments. I talked about royalties and development of a new product. Gold kiwi fruit started off with an importation of germplasm, grafting material on, accepted by the industry, and that took from almost 10 years to decide to commercialise it. It's licensed to the industry, to Zespri, so they get the plant variety rights. They went to marketing it. The plant variety rights were transferred to Zespri in 2004, and we had something like a $400 million industry by 2012. New industry. not cannibalizing the old one, and Plant Food had the royalties coming back to it. This is the type of close industry relationship that we're working on. And I'll just flip to that because that's time. But in fact, 25% of the volume, 40% of the value, very high value, $4 billion in sales overall to date, 70 million royalties to Plant Food. That's the model: new varieties, new product development, production, post-harvest marketing, feedback loop across the value chain. We're commercially driven, financially viable. We must underpin New Zealand's economic growth, but amongst all that, we must be excellent research, be science leaders. We will not have credibility without good science as well. We have to be able to do it all. I'm not saying we do, but it's something to strive for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, for a very inspiring talk. Je pense qu'on a eu un bon exemple d'une conférence réellement inspirante. C'est de la musique à mes oreilles de voir la concertation qui existe en Nouvelle-Zélande et l'effort et la science qui vise pour le développement des filières. Je pense qu'on a un bon exemple à suivre pour l'organisation de la recherche ici au Québec. Étant l'heure de jeu ici, je vais poser deux questions pour peut-être ouvrir avoir d'autres questions de l'audience par la suite. I have two questions here. They relate to, you talked about the priorities. What's the role of universities into this? And my second question is, who pays for extension?
Okay. The role of universities. We do a lot of collaboration with universities. In fact, Plant Food has established a joint graduate school with the University of Auckland, where about 10 of our staff are joint appointments. That means true joint appointments, where the university pays 20% of their salary and Plant Food pays 80%. It allows direct primary supervision of students. But also, government encourages, because of this team approach, and we encourage it ourselves, a large number of our competitive programs going into government and sometimes with industry has university staff on it. And the universities are also very keen to work with the Crown Research Institutes, because the Crown Research Institutes bring the industry to the university. Industries are very wary of working with universities in New Zealand because they know that they'll get a contract and then the university staff will put a student onto it. They prefer to work with active scientists in the CRIs and working through the universities that way. But we have a very close relationship and there's a lot of co-development going on. Extension, who pays for it? The growers pay for it. As I said, there was a revolution in this 20-odd years ago when the extension services were removed and extension went private. It did not perform very well because it took a lot of readjustment. But all the extension work that goes on within the CRI, university interface, is part of these programs and part of these contracts. And in fact, there is an incentive for the Crown Research Institute to actually ensure there is good implementation and extension if they're getting something back for it. It's a non-commercial model, a market model. If you're getting royalties back, you better make sure that your new variety is established in the orchard, it is serviced, you continue to look after it and do things with it, and you can reach right in. Just as we encourage the industry to reach into our programs at early stages and get involved. So extension gets paid for by the grower.
Thank you very much. That's the question I wanted to, the answer I wanted to hear. Luce.
Thank you for your presentation. What advice would you have to give to our sector, and fruit, vegetable, and ornamental sectors who have a tremendous amount of potential to develop, but at the same time it doesn't get the attention from the government and also from the industry in terms of investment in research dollars?
I keep coming back to the model of industry research organisation. I think that we have developed, I'm talking we, I think internationally, we been performing on the basis of a transactional model, which means that you provide a service, the research organisation provides a service, which is bought by the industry. I don't think that works. I don't think it works. It might work if you're selling a piece of kit or we call it widgets, or selling a thing. But when you're selling science and R&D, I think the transactional model is not a good one. You need to sit down as a partnership, and you need to have joint strategies. You need to sit around the table early on and decide where the research is going to be, where the research is needed. And you need to develop something like an operating agreement, which is what we develop with our industries, where there's a close understanding about how you operate. And it means that when you come to do contractual research, and after all, in the end, it is going to be under contract, you already have a relationship understanding about what you want to achieve. And that then also has to include the extension and implementation, because you may not believe it, but scientists these days are very unhappy if nothing happens with their science. You sometimes think that the view of the scientist is that he'll do what he wants to do, publish a paper, job done, don't care. It's not the case in most cases these days, certainly in research organisations, government research organisations. Scientists get very frustrated and not being able to see what's going to happen with their research. So I think, for your question, you have to go back and look at the model in which you're working with an R&D organisation. Contractual, transactional, arm's length relationships are not the ones which are going to be the most successful. You have to get back and work in a partnership. You don't have to worry about being an even partnership or even how much money you've got on the table, but it's a common thinking about what you want to achieve. And that the research organisation, we get a lot of criticism for being told you just want to make your own money and be successful as an organisation. Well, the government's told us to. It said you have to be a viable organisation. We have to make money, but we're also there. And we have to underpin economic growth. That's our whole mission. And so, in the end, you have the same endpoint as industry does to achieve growth. So, it's about an operating agreement and about a partnership, not a transaction.
We're going to take one last question. On prend une dernière question. Et je vous rappelle que l'on va avoir une table ronde et on aura peut-être la chance par la suite de ramener certains éléments à M. Ferguson et aux autres panélistes par la suite. M. Flévinage.
Flévinage, chairman of CTIFE. Who has been the leading group in the evolution of your model when you decided to change your organization? Was it growers, scientists, government, traders?
I think it was government. It was a government of the day which had come out of, if you think back, if you know anything about New Zealand, we were one of the first in the days of, and some of us can remember, well or not well, the days of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan, market-driven economies, where the whole swing went very, very far. Way down the bottom of the globe, New Zealand, and a lot of people didn't see it, was one of the first to change a lot of its economic thinking in that direction. It took away all subsidies from farmers, so New Zealand agriculture has no subsidies. It is one of the purest in the world, and the farmers suffered but got over it and became profitable. Actually, I'm on the left wing, so I'm giving right-wing policies and saying they're successful. I'm a good old socialist. So it did that. It sold a lot of government assets. Well, that is what governments do under these sorts of governments. But it set up a lot of its own business as what it calls state-owned enterprises or separate businesses. It tried to do it with the health system and it failed. It didn't work. But it did it with the science system. It decided to take that market-driven economic philosophy which was current at the time, and it decided that it would do it with the science system because it believed that by setting them up as a company with the market drive would be more successful in developing science for economic growth. And I think it was a good move. It had 2 or 3 big problems. One was this long-term stability, where the staff had no security. We learned to live with that until this core funding came, but that was a negative feature. And also, there's too much drive for profit. In other words, too much financial drive at the expense of getting the science into the system. And I think that has balanced out. But it was a government drive, a government philosophy.
Thank you very much for this talk once again.